The pawnshop receipt was still warm from the printer when I found it crumpled in Sarah's jeans pocket while doing laundry. 47 years of marriage reduced to $300 cash for what the ticket called vintage gold band with small diamonds. My wedding ring. The ring that had never left my finger except for 2 surgeries and the birth of my children. The ring my husband David slipped on my finger in 1976 when we promised each other forever before cancer took him 2 years ago and left me navigating this world alone. Sarah had stolen it right off my nightstand while I slept, and I knew exactly what those $300 had bought. I stood in my laundry room, 64 years old, holding that crumpled receipt in my trembling hands, and something inside me just died. Not the sharp death of losing David, but the slow, cold death of realizing that your own child sees you as nothing more than a resource to be plucked clean. The washing machine hummed its familiar tune, but everything else in my world had gone silent. This wasn't the first time, of course. Oh no, this was just the latest casualty in what I was beginning to understand had been a systematic campaign to strip me of everything I held dear. It started small, the way these things always do, little things missing here and there after Sarah's visits. David's coin collection disappeared from his office about 6 months after the funeral. I convinced myself I had moved it somewhere safe and forgotten. Then his fishing tackle box vanished from the garage. Again, I thought maybe I had donated it and blocked out the memory in my grief. But when my mother's pearl bracelet disappeared from my jewelry box, the one piece I had specifically told Sarah she would inherit someday, I started paying closer attention. I started noticing how Sarah's visits always coincided with urgent financial crises, how she always had just enough time to use the bathroom upstairs near my bedroom before rushing off to handle whatever emergency had brought her to my door. You have to understand something about Sarah. She wasn't always like this. She was my baby, my youngest, the one who used to crawl into bed with David and me on Sunday mornings and make us breakfast in bed that was more eggshell than egg. She was the one who cried when she accidentally stepped on a beetle, who rescued stray cats and brought them home in her backpack. She was tender-hearted and creative, always drawing pictures of our family with those stick figures that somehow managed to capture more love than any photograph ever could. The drugs started in high school. Not the hard stuff at first, just marijuana that I found in her room during what I thought was a routine cleaning. David and I handled it the way we thought we should. We grounded her, we took away privileges, we enrolled her in counseling, we thought we were being responsible parents. We thought love and boundaries would be enough. We didn't understand then that addiction isn't a choice that can be reasoned with or loved away. We didn't understand that our beautiful, tender-hearted daughter was already disappearing, being replaced by someone who would eventually see her mother's wedding ring as nothing more than a solution to her most pressing need. Over the years, we tried everything. Rehab programs that cost us our vacation savings. Therapy sessions that Sarah attended with the glazed look of someone simply running out the clock. Interventions that ended with her storming out and disappearing for weeks at a time. We refinanced the house twice to pay for treatment programs. We sold David's classic Mustang, the one he had restored in our garage over 3 painstaking years, to pay for a residential facility in Arizona that promised miracles. We gave and gave and gave, always believing that the next program, the next approach, the next show of unconditional love would bring our daughter back. David handled it better than I did, or maybe he just hid his heartbreak more skillfully. He would sit in his recliner after another failed attempt to help Sarah, staring at the evening news without really seeing it, and I could feel the weight of his disappointment settling over our living room like dust. We stopped talking about Sarah's future and started talking about just getting through each day. We learned to hide our valuables when she visited. We learned to count the cash in our wallets before and after her stops by. We learned to love someone who was slowly but surely teaching us that love alone wasn't enough. When David got sick, Sarah seemed to rally. She visited more often, helped me navigate the maze of doctors and treatments and insurance forms. She held my hand in hospital waiting rooms and brought me coffee that had gone cold while I sat vigil beside David's bed. For a few precious months, I thought maybe his illness had shocked her into clarity. Maybe the prospect of losing her father had finally broken through the fog of addiction. Maybe this was the turning point we had prayed for through all those long, terrible years. But addiction is patient. It waits for moments of vulnerability, moments when your guard is down because you're dealing with something bigger than yourself. While I was focused on David's chemotherapy schedule and managing his pain medication and trying to be strong for both of us, Sarah was quietly cataloging everything in our house that might have resale value. She was learning my routines, noting when I was too exhausted to pay attention, figuring out which of David's possessions I was too overwhelmed to miss right away. The worst part, and this is something that still keeps me awake some nights, is that I was grateful for her presence during David's final months. I was so thankful to have my daughter there, seemingly supportive and loving, that I ignored the little signs that should have warned me. I ignored how she always volunteered to run errands that took her through David's study. I ignored how she insisted on cleaning the kitchen after dinner, giving her access to areas of the house where we kept important papers and spare keys. I ignored the way she asked seemingly innocent questions about David's pension and insurance policies and what would happen to the house after he was gone. David died on a Tuesday morning in March, holding my hand and telling me he loved me, and I thought the hardest part of my life was over. I thought grief was the enemy I would have to fight. I had no idea that my own daughter was waiting for the funeral to be over, for the casseroles to stop coming, for the well-meaning visitors to return to their own lives, before she began the systematic dismantling of everything David and I had built together. It started with his tools, good tools, the kind a craftsman accumulates over decades of work. I noticed they were gone when I finally worked up the courage to clean out the garage 6 months after the funeral. Sarah explained that she thought I wouldn't want them cluttering up the space, so she had donated them to Habitat for Humanity. It sounded reasonable, even thoughtful. I felt guilty for questioning her motives. Then his books disappeared from the den, first editions of Hemingway and Steinbeck that he had collected since college. Again, Sarah had an explanation. She thought I might want to downsize, and books were so heavy and dusty. She had found them a good home with someone who would appreciate them. Each theft came wrapped in concern for my well-being. Each violation of our home was presented as an act of love, a daughter helping her grieving mother simplify her life. And because I was grieving, because I was lonely, because I wanted so desperately to believe that my child was finally the caring, responsible adult I had always hoped she would become, I let myself be convinced. I let myself believe that my discomfort was just the normal difficulty of letting go of David's belongings, not the justified outrage of someone being systematically robbed by their own child. The wedding ring was different, though. The wedding ring crossed a line that I couldn't rationalize away or reframe as helpful. That ring had been on my finger for 47 years. It had been there when I held each of my children for the first time. It had been there when I signed the deed to our first house, and when we celebrated David's promotion and when we danced at our 25th anniversary party. It had been there through every argument and reconciliation, every crisis and celebration, every ordinary Tuesday that had made up the substance of our marriage. Taking that ring wasn't about helping me downsize or simplify. Taking that ring was about reducing the most sacred symbol of my life to street value for drugs. I sat down at my kitchen table with that pawn shop receipt and forced myself to confront the full scope of what had been happening. I made a list of everything that had disappeared since David's death. The tools, the books, the coin collection, the tackle box, my mother's bracelet, David's watch collection that had been in his dresser drawer, the silver service we received as a wedding gift, the hand tools from David's workshop, even the spare tire from my car that I only discovered was missing when I had a flat on the highway and Oshkopopoe had to provide a replacement. Item by item, I calculated the value of what Sarah had taken from me, and the total made my stomach turn. Nearly $15,000 worth of possessions, stolen from a grieving widow by her own daughter. $15,000 that represented not just monetary value, but memories, history, the carefully accumulated treasures of a lifetime spent building something meaningful with someone I loved. $15,000 that Sarah had converted into pills or powder or whatever temporary escape addiction demanded that week. But it was more than the money, more than the things. It was the violation of trust, the exploitation of grief, the cold calculation required to steal from someone who was already broken. It was the realization that while I had been mourning my husband, my daughter had been conducting an inventory of my life, determining what could be taken and what needed to be left behind to maintain the pretense of caring. I called Sarah that evening, and she answered on the fourth ring with the slightly delayed response of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of something they don't want to explain. I told her I had found the pawn shop receipt. I told her I knew what she had done, and I waited for what I thought would be shame, remorse, maybe even an acknowledgement of how deeply she had hurt me. Instead, I got anger. Not the hot defensive anger of someone caught in wrongdoing, but the cold calculating anger of someone who resented being questioned about their right to take what they wanted. She told me it was just a ring, just metal and stones that were sitting in a jewelry box and doing nothing while she had real problems to solve. She told me I was being selfish, hoarding things I didn't even wear anymore while she was struggling. She told me that David would have wanted her to have whatever she needed, that I was dishonoring his memory by caring more about objects than about my own daughter's well-being. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but in those 10 minutes, I heard the voice of someone I didn't recognize. Someone who had learned to justify anything, rationalize everything, transform their victim into the perpetrator with the smooth efficiency of a seasoned manipulator. Someone who could steal their mother's wedding ring and then make that mother feel guilty for being upset about it. When I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, watching the evening light fade from the windows and trying to understand how I had gotten to this place. How I had become someone who could be systematically robbed by their own child and then made to feel guilty for objecting. How I had raised someone who could look at my grief and see opportunity. How I had spent 20 years trying to save someone who had apparently decided I was worth more to them stripped and sold than loved and protected. That night, I did something I hadn't done since David died. I got angry. Not sad, not disappointed, not heartbroken, though I was all of those things too. But angry in a way that felt clean and sharp and clarifying. Angry in a way that cut through the fog of grief and guilt and codependent love that had been clouding my judgment for months. Angry in a way that made me realize I still had fight left in me, even if I hadn't known where to direct it until now. I spent the next 3 days doing research. I learned about pawn shops and how they operated, about what identification was required to sell items, and how long they held things before putting them up for sale. I learned that my wedding ring was probably still there, waiting out its mandatory holding period before becoming available to the public. I learned that I could retrieve it if I could prove ownership and pay the loan amount plus fees and interest. More importantly, I started learning about my legal options. I discovered that theft from a family member was still theft in the eyes of the law. I learned about elder abuse statutes and how they applied to financial exploitation. I learned about the process for pressing charges and what kind of evidence I would need. I learned that being someone's mother didn't make you fair game for their criminal behavior, no matter how society might expect you to absorb abuse in the name of unconditional love. But mostly I learned about myself. I learned that underneath the grief and confusion and desperate hope that had characterized the last 2 years of my life, there was still the woman David had fallen in love with. The woman who had raised 3 children and managed a household and built a career and navigated all the challenges that life had thrown at us over nearly 5 decades. The woman who had somehow gotten lost in the maze of addiction and codependency, but was still there, still capable of clear thinking and decisive action when the situation demanded it. On Thursday morning, I drove to the pawn shop on Meridian Street, the one listed on the receipt I had found in Sarah's pocket. It was a small, cluttered shop in a strip mall between a check-cashing place and a store that sold phone accessories, the kind of place I had never had reason to visit before my daughter introduced me to this particular corner of the economy. The man behind the counter was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who dealt with difficult situations regularly. I showed him the receipt and explained what had happened. He didn't seem surprised. He told me that family theft was more common than most people realized, that he saw situations like mine several times a week. He explained the process for retrieving stolen merchandise, the fees involved, the paperwork required. He was professional but not unsympathetic, and I got the impression that he genuinely felt bad about the circumstances that had brought me to his shop. The ring was there, cataloged and tagged and waiting in a small envelope with a dozen other pieces of jewelry in similar situations. It looked smaller somehow, diminished by its journey through the machinery of desperation and commerce. But when I slipped it back onto my finger and felt its familiar weight settle into the groove it had worn over 47 years, I felt something shift inside me. Not just relief at having it back, but a sense of reclaiming something larger than the ring itself. A sense of reclaiming my right to decide what was sacred and what could be sacrificed, what was mine to give and what was not mine to lose. The total cost to retrieve my ring was $423. The $300 Sarah had received plus fees and interest accumulated during the holding period. I wrote the check without hesitation, but as I drove home with my wedding ring back where it belonged, I found myself thinking about that number. $423. Not a fortune by any stretch, but not nothing either. Enough to cover a week's worth of groceries or a month of utility bills. Enough to represent real sacrifice for someone living on a fixed income. Enough to make me angry all over again at the casualness with which Sarah had cost me money I couldn't easily spare. That evening, I sat down at my dining room table with a legal pad and began making lists. Not just of what Sarah had stolen, but of what I had given her over the years. The rehab programs and therapy sessions and treatment facilities, the rent money when she got evicted from apartments, the car payments when she couldn't hold down a job, the lawyer fees when she got arrested, the bail money that never got repaid, The credit card bills she had run up in my name without permission, the loans from my retirement account that were supposed to be temporary but had become permanent fixtures in my monthly budget. I added it all up, every dollar I could remember spending on Sarah's addiction over the past 20 years. The number was staggering, nearly $80,000, not counting the value of the items she had stolen. $80,000 that could have gone toward my retirement, toward home improvements, toward travel and experiences, and all the things David and I had planned to do with our golden years before cancer cut our time short. $80,000 that had bought me nothing but heartache and the erosion of boundaries I should have maintained from the beginning. But it wasn't really about the money, of course. It was about what the money represented. It was about the fact that Sarah saw me as an ATM machine rather than a person. It was about the way addiction had taught her to evaluate every relationship in terms of what could be extracted from it. It was about how I had become an enabler disguised as a loving mother, funding her destruction while calling it support. I thought about David and what he would want me to do. David, who had loved Sarah fiercely, but who had also begun talking, in his final months, about the need to set firmer boundaries. David, who had worried about what would happen to me after he was gone, who had made me promise to take care of myself and not let anyone take advantage of my grief. David, who would be heartbroken to know that his death had become the starting gun for Sarah's systematic looting of our life together. On Friday morning, I called my lawyer, not the family attorney who had handled David's estate and who knew Sarah and would likely counsel patience and understanding, but a new lawyer who specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation. A woman about my age named Margaret Chen who listened to my story without interruption and then asked me a simple question that no one else had thought to pose. What do you want to happen? It was such a basic question, but it stopped me cold. For 20 years, I had been so focused on what Sarah needed, what might help her, what might save her, that I had never really considered what I wanted. I had never allowed myself to prioritize my own well-being or to acknowledge that I had rights in this relationship too. I had been so afraid of being seen as an uncaring mother that I had forgotten I was also a human being deserving of respect and consideration. What did I want to happen? I wanted my daughter back, of course. I wanted the tender-hearted little girl who used to make me breakfast in bed and cry over dead beetles, but I was beginning to understand that wanting something and enabling its absence were two different things. I was beginning to understand that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was just another form of addiction, equally destructive to everyone involved. Margaret Chen helped me understand my options. I could press charges for theft, which would create a legal record of Sarah's behavior and might motivate her to seek treatment. I could pursue civil action to recover the value of what had been stolen, which would protect my financial interests and establish clear consequences for future violations. I could seek a restraining order that would prevent Sarah from entering my home without supervision, which would protect my remaining possessions and my peace of mind. Or I could do nothing. I could continue to absorb the abuse and hope that Sarah eventually found her way back to the person she used to be. I could continue to be the kind of mother who prioritized her child's immediate comfort over her long-term well-being. I could continue to fund addiction while calling it love. Margaret Chen didn't pressure me to make any particular choice, but she did help me understand something important. Enabling was not, loving, and consequences were not cruelty. She helped me see that my misguided attempts to protect Sarah from the results of her choices had actually prevented her from experiencing the kind of rock-bottom moment that sometimes motivates people to seek real help. She helped me understand that by absorbing the costs of Sarah's addiction, I had made it easier for her to continue using and harder for her to recognize the need for change. I went home that afternoon and sat in David's recliner, looking around our living room at all the empty spaces where his things used to be. I thought about the life we had built together and how systematically it was being dismantled. I thought about the woman I had been before addiction moved into our lives like a terrible houseguest who never leaves. I thought about the woman I could still be if I found the courage to prioritize my own well-being for once. That evening, Sarah called me. She had heard from someone that I had been to the pawn shop, and she wanted to make sure I understood that she had every intention of paying me back for the ring. She had a job interview lined up, she said, and once she got back on her feet financially, she would make everything right. She was sorry for the misunderstanding, she said, and she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive her for the temporary loan of something I wasn't even using anyway. Listening to her talk, I heard the voice of addiction speaking. Not Sarah, but the disease that had taken her place, using her vocal cords to spin the same familiar web of promises and rationalizations and emotional manipulation that had been trapping me for 2 decades. I heard the assumption that my love could be counted on to absorb any betrayal, any violation, any cruelty, as long as it was packaged in the language of need and desperation. For the first time in 20 years, I didn't take the bait. I didn't reassure her that everything was fine or agree that the ring was just a temporary loan or promise to be patient while she figured out her life. Instead, I told her the truth. I told her that I knew exactly what she had done and why she had done it. I told her that I was tired of being treated like a resource rather than a person. I told her that I was done enabling her addiction by absorbing the consequences of her choices. The conversation didn't go well. Sarah moved quickly from apology to anger to threats to tears, cycling through every emotional manipulation technique in her arsenal. She told me I was abandoning her in her time of greatest need. She told me that David would be ashamed of my lack of compassion. She told me that I was choosing money over my own daughter. She told me that if I really loved her, I would understand that addiction was a disease and she couldn't help what she did when she was using. All of it was probably true in its way. Addiction is a disease, and Sarah probably couldn't help some of her behaviors, but I was beginning to understand that this disease was not just hers. I had my own version of it, my own compulsive behavior that kept me locked in patterns that hurt both of us. My addiction was to being needed, to being the mother who never gave up, to maintaining the illusion that love alone could solve any problem. When Sarah realized that her usual tactics weren't working, she shifted to a different strategy. She told me she was pregnant. 4 months along, she said, and the baby's father was out of the picture. She needed help getting clean for the sake of her grandchild. She needed a stable place to stay while she figured out her next steps. She needed me to choose between being a grandmother or being a woman who cared more about material possessions than about family. I wish I could say that this revelation didn't affect me, that I was strong enough to recognize it as just another manipulation technique. But the truth is that it hit me like a physical blow. The possibility of a grandchild, of having a piece of David in the world again, of maybe having the chance to love someone in Sarah's family who could love me back, it was almost enough to make me forget everything I had learned over the past week. Almost. But not quite. Because something Margaret Chen had said kept echoing in my mind. What do you want to happen? And what I wanted was not to be a grandmother who got manipulated and stolen from and treated as a source of funding rather than a person. What I wanted was not to watch another generation get damaged by the same cycles of addiction and enabling that had already cost me my daughter and my husband's peace of mind and nearly 20 years of our retirement savings. I told Sarah that if she was really pregnant, I would support her in getting proper prenatal care and addiction treatment, but that support would come with clear boundaries and professional oversight. I told her that I would help her find a residential treatment program that could accommodate pregnant women and that I would visit her and support her recovery process. But I also told her that she could not move back into my house. She could not have unsupervised access to my belongings, and she could not continue to treat our relationship as an opportunity for financial exploitation. Sarah hung up on me. 2 days later, she called back to tell me that she had miscarried. Whether she had ever been pregnant in the first place, or whether this was just the next iteration of her manipulation strategy, I'll never know. What I did know was that I couldn't keep living in a world where every conversation with my daughter was a potential emotional ambush, where every expression of love and concern was met with demands for money or access, or the sacrifice of my own well-being. The following Monday, I went back to Margaret Chen's office and signed the paperwork to press charges for theft. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but also one of the clearest. I wasn't pressing charges to punish Sarah or to get revenge. I was pressing charges to establish boundaries, to create consequences, and to protect myself from further exploitation. I was pressing charges because love without limits isn't love. It's just another form of abuse. The legal process took several months, during which Sarah tried every approach she could think of to get me to drop the charges. She sent friends and relatives to talk to me about the importance of forgiveness and family loyalty. She wrote me letters from jail apologizing for her behavior and promising to change if I would just give her one more chance. She had other family members call me to explain how much I was hurting her and how this legal action would ruin any chance she had of getting her life together. All of it was probably sincere in its way. Sarah probably did feel sorry and scared and desperate. She probably did want to change and probably did believe, in that moment, that she could do better if I would just trust her one more time. But I had learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and the temporary regret that comes from facing consequences. I had learned that the best way to show love for someone with an addiction was to allow them to experience the full weight of their choices rather than cushioning them from reality. The theft charges resulted in a plea bargain that included restitution, community service, and mandatory participation in a drug treatment program. Sarah was angry about the criminal record, but she was more angry about the restitution order, which required her to pay me back for everything she had stolen over the past 2 years. It was a substantial amount, and she complained bitterly that I was being vindictive and unreasonable in pursuing financial compensation from someone who was clearly struggling. But the restitution wasn't about the money, though I certainly needed it. The restitution was about accountability, about Sarah learning that actions have consequences and that other people's property and well-being have value that can't be dismissed just because you have problems of your own. The restitution was about teaching her, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, that being someone's child didn't give her the right to exploit that relationship without limit. Around the same time, I made another decision that surprised even me. I put my house on the market, the house David and I had bought as newlyweds, where we had raised our children and celebrated holidays and built our life together. The house that held 47 years of memories and represented everything we had worked for. The house that Sarah had been systematically looting and that I now understood she probably viewed as her eventual inheritance rather than my current home. Margaret Chen helped me understand that as long as I lived in that house, I would never be fully free from Sarah's manipulations. The house represented access to memories she could hold hostage, to possessions she could steal, to my emotional vulnerability about the life David and I had shared there. As long as I stayed in that house, I would be living in the past while Sarah continued to exploit my attachment to it. The decision to sell wasn't just about protecting myself from the future theft, though that was certainly part of it. It was about reclaiming my right to define my own future rather than living as a custodian of the past. It was about recognizing that the love David and I had shared wasn't contained in a building or a collection of objects, but in the experiences we had shared and the lessons he had taught me about strength and resilience and the importance of protecting what truly mattered. When Sarah found out about the sale, she was furious in a way I had never seen before. She screamed at me over the phone about how I was destroying her childhood, how I was erasing her father's memory, how I was being selfish and cruel. She demanded to know where I thought I was going to live and what I thought I was going to do with myself in some sterile apartment or retirement community. She demanded to know what was going to happen to all of David's things, to the family photos, to the Christmas decorations and birthday party memories and all the accumulated debris of our life together. What she was really demanding to know, I realized, was what was going to happen to her access to my resources. What she was really asking was how she was supposed to continue exploiting our relationship if I removed myself from the familiar battlefield where she had been winning for so many years. What she was really afraid of was that I might discover that I could be happy and healthy and whole without constantly managing her crises and absorbing her chaos. I found a lovely condominium about 20 miles away in a community designed for people my age who wanted to maintain their independence while having access to services and social opportunities. It was smaller than our house, but still large enough for me to keep the things that truly mattered. It had better security than our old neighborhood, making it harder for unwelcome visitors to gain access. Most importantly, it represented a fresh start, a place where I could build a life based on my own choices rather than reactions to other people's problems. The process of sorting through 47 years of accumulated possessions was overwhelming at first, but it became surprisingly therapeutic. Each decision about what to keep and what to let go was also a decision about who I wanted to be in this new chapter of my life. I kept David's photographs and letters, but I gave away his clothes to men who could actually use them. I kept the books we had both loved, but I sold the collections that had been more about investment than enjoyment. I kept the furniture that was comfortable and beautiful, but I donated the pieces that were just taking up space. Most importantly, I secured the things that had true sentimental value. I opened a safe, deposit box for my jewelry, and important documents. I moved David's ashes to a place of honor in my new home where I could talk to him every morning over coffee, but where they would be safe from anyone who might see them as leverage in some future manipulation. I created photo albums and memory boxes for my other children so they could have pieces of our family history that were meaningful to them without those memories being held hostage by Sarah's addiction. When the house sold, Sarah made one final attempt to guilt me into changing my mind. She showed up at the closing with tears in her eyes, begging me to reconsider, promising that she would change and that we could start fresh in our old home together. She painted a picture of mother and daughter supporting each other through difficult times, of family loyalty triumphing over temporary setbacks, of love conquering addiction through patience and understanding. It was a beautiful fantasy, and part of me desperately wanted to believe it was possible. But I had learned to distinguish between hope and delusion, between love and enabling, between supporting someone's recovery and funding their destruction. I had learned that the most loving thing I could do for Sarah was to stop making her problems easier to manage and her choices free of consequences. I moved into my condominium on a bright Saturday morning in October, almost exactly 2 years after David's death. My other children came to help me unpack, and we spent the day arranging furniture and hanging pictures and creating a new space that honored the past while embracing the future. It felt like the first day of a life I had chosen for myself rather than a life that had been shaped entirely by other people's needs and crises. Sarah didn't come to help with the move. She was in the court-ordered treatment program, participating in the kind of intensive professional intervention that my amateur efforts had never been able to provide. I received reports from her counselors about her progress, and the reports were cautiously optimistic. She was beginning to understand the impact of her addiction on the people who loved her. She was beginning to take responsibility for her choices rather than blaming her behavior on circumstances or other people. She was beginning to do the hard work of recovery rather than just making promises about change. It would be nice to say that our relationship was immediately healed by these developments, but recovery from codependency takes time, just like recovery from addiction. I had to learn how to love Sarah without enabling her, how to support her recovery without absorbing responsibility for it, how to be her mother without being her victim. She had to learn how to be in relationship with someone she couldn't exploit, how to ask for help without demanding rescue, how to accept consequences without blaming others for imposing them. The process was slow and sometimes painful. Sarah was angry for a long time about the legal consequences of her theft and the loss of easy access to my resources. She complained to anyone who would listen that I had abandoned her in her time of greatest need, that I had chosen money over family, that I was heartless and cruel. Some people agreed with her assessment. Some relatives stopped speaking to me, convinced that I was being unnecessarily harsh with a daughter who was struggling with addiction. But other people understood what I had done and why I had done it. Margaret Chen introduced me to a support group for families affected by addiction, where I met other parents who had faced similar choices and made similar decisions. I learned that I wasn't alone in struggling with the difference between love and enabling. I learned that setting boundaries with an addicted family member was one of the most difficult and necessary acts of love possible. I also discovered that I enjoyed my new life in ways that surprised me. Without the constant drama of managing Sarah's crises, I had energy for other relationships and activities. I joined a book club and a hiking group. I volunteered at the local animal shelter. I took painting classes and rediscovered a creativity I had forgotten I possessed. I traveled to places David and I had talked about visiting, but never quite managed to reach. Most importantly, I developed friendships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I learned what it felt like to have relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than need and exploitation. I remembered what it was like to look forward to social interactions rather than dreading them as opportunities for manipulation or demands for rescue. About 18 months after the house sale, Sarah completed her treatment program and reached out to me with a different kind of communication than I had received from her in years. She didn't ask for money or housing or help with some crisis. Instead, she asked if we could meet for coffee and talk about our relationship. She said she had some things she needed to say to me, and she hoped I would be willing to listen. We met at a small cafe near my condominium, and Sarah looked different than she had in years. Healthier, certainly, but also more present. Her eyes were clear and focused in a way they hadn't been since her teenage years. She sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap and told me she was sorry. Not sorry in the manipulative, crisis-driven way that had characterized her apologies for the past 2 decades, but sorry in the deep, genuine way of someone who had finally understood the full impact of their actions. She apologized for stealing from me, for exploiting my grief, for treating me as a resource rather than a person. She apologized for the years of manipulation and lies and broken promises. She apologized for making David's final years more difficult than they needed to be, for adding family stress to his battle with cancer. She apologized for stealing his things after he died, for turning his memory into something that could be sold for drug money. Most importantly, she apologized for the person she had become and the mother she had forced me to become in response. She said she understood now that my decision to press charges and sell the house hadn't been acts of cruelty, but acts of love. She said the treatment program had helped her understand that enabling someone's addiction wasn't helping them. It was helping them destroy themselves more efficiently. I listened to all of this with a mixture of hope and caution that I had learned to balance over the past 2 years. I had heard Sarah apologize before many times, and I had learned not to mistake temporary remorse for lasting change. But there was something different about this apology, something that felt less like a performance and more like genuine accountability. She didn't ask me for anything. She didn't try to minimize her behavior or blame it on circumstances beyond her control. She didn't present her recovery as a transaction where my forgiveness was the payment she was owed for getting clean. Instead, she told me about the work she was doing in recovery, the daily effort required to stay sober, and the ongoing process of learning to live with the consequences of her past choices. She told me she was working part-time at a grocery store and living in a sober living facility, paying her own way for the first time in years. She told me she was making restitution payments every month, slowly but consistently working to pay back what she had stolen from me. She also told me she understood if I couldn't trust her yet, if I needed more time to see that her changes were real and lasting rather than temporary. She said she didn't expect our relationship to go back to the way it had been before. She understood that the way it had been before was unhealthy for both of us. She said she hoped we could build something new together, based on mutual respect rather than her need and my enabling. It was the most honest conversation Sarah and I had ever had about our relationship and the ways addiction had twisted it into something unrecognizable. It was also the beginning of what has been a slow, careful process of rebuilding trust and establishing new boundaries. We meet for coffee once a month now, and Sarah calls me every few weeks to check in. She tells me about her job and her recovery meetings and the friends she's making in the sober community. She asks about my activities and actually listens to my answers, rather than waiting for an opportunity to turn the conversation toward her immediate needs. The relationship we have now is different from what we had when she was a child, and it's certainly different from the dysfunctional dynamic that characterized her adult years before recovery. It's more careful, more deliberate, more honest about the limitations that exist between us. But it's also more genuine, more respectful, more based on who we actually are rather than who we wished we could be or thought we were supposed to be. Sarah has been sober for 3 years now, and she has continued to make steady progress in rebuilding her life and relationships. She completed her community service requirements and finished paying her restitution to me ahead of schedule. She was promoted to shift supervisor at the grocery store where she works, and she has moved into her own apartment after 2 years in supervised housing. She has started dating someone she met through her recovery program, a man who understands the challenges of maintaining sobriety and supports her ongoing commitment to it. More importantly, from my perspective, she has consistently respected the boundaries I established during the worst period of our relationship. She has never asked me for money since that conversation in the cafe 3 years ago. She has never shown up at my home unannounced or tried to manipulate me through guilt or emotional pressure. She has accepted that our relationship exists on terms that work for both of us, not just for her immediate needs. I know that addiction is a lifelong struggle, and I know that recovery isn't a straight line from crisis to health. I know that Sarah could relapse tomorrow, and if she does, I have prepared myself to maintain the boundaries that protect both of us from falling back into the destructive patterns that characterized our relationship for so many years. I love my daughter, but I have learned to love her in a way that honors my own well-being and doesn't enable her potential for self-destruction. The house sale, which Sarah initially saw as such a betrayal, turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made for both of us. The financial security it provided has allowed me to live comfortably without depending on my children for support, which removes the economic pressure that can complicate family relationships. The physical distance it created has prevented the casual exploitation that was possible when Sarah knew exactly where to find me and what valuable items might be available for quick conversion to cash. Most importantly, selling the house forced both of us to let go of the fantasy that we could somehow return to an earlier, healthier version of our relationship without doing the hard work of addressing the problems that had corrupted it. The house represented the past, with all its accumulated resentments and established patterns of dysfunction. My condominium represents the present and future, with relationships based on choice rather than obligation and love expressed through respect rather than rescue. I've been living in my condominium for 4 years now, and I can honestly say that I'm happier and healthier than I have been since Sarah's addiction first began, affecting our family dynamics 20 years ago. I have friends who enjoy my company and don't see me as a source of financial or emotional support for their various crises. I have hobbies and interests that bring me joy rather than just filling time between family emergencies. I have a sense of control over my own life that I had almost forgotten was possible. People sometimes ask me if I regret pressing charges against my own daughter or if I feel guilty about selling the family home. The answer is complicated because I do grieve the loss of the relationship I thought we had and the family dynamic I believed we could maintain. I do feel sad that it took legal intervention to establish boundaries that should have existed naturally between people who loved each other. But I don't regret protecting myself from ongoing exploitation, and I don't regret refusing to enable Sarah's addiction by absorbing the consequences of her choices. I don't regret choosing my own well-being over the comfort of maintaining familiar but destructive patterns. I don't regret teaching Sarah that love requires mutual respect and that being someone's mother doesn't make me obligated to accept abuse or theft. Most of all, I don't regret honoring David's memory by taking care of the woman he loved, instead of letting that woman be systematically destroyed by misguided maternal devotion. David worried about what would happen to me after he was gone, and I think he would be proud of the strength I found to protect myself when a protection became necessary. I think he would approve of the life I've built, with its emphasis on genuine relationships and personal fulfillment rather than crisis management and emotional rescue operations. The wedding ring that started this whole journey sits on my finger now as I write this, still bearing the slight indentations from 47 years of wear, still catching the light in ways that remind me of the promises David and I made to each other in 1976. It's been a brief, terrible period in a pawn shop, reduced to its cash value and stripped of its emotional significance. But like me, it found its way back to where it belonged, and like me, it survived the experience with its essential value intact. That ring has become a symbol for me of something larger than marriage or commitment, though it certainly represents those things too. It represents the importance of protecting what is sacred from those who would exploit or diminish it. It represents the strength required to set boundaries with people we love when those boundaries become necessary for survival. It represents the possibility of reclaiming dignity and self-respect, even after they have been systematically attacked by someone we trusted. I look at that ring every morning when I wake up, and it reminds me of the woman David fell in love with, the woman who somehow survived 20 years of addiction-related chaos and still found the courage to choose self-respect over enabling, boundaries over codependency, honest love over comfortable dysfunction. It reminds me that protecting what matters isn't selfish, it's necessary, it's healthy, and it's often the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. Sarah and I will probably never have the close, uncomplicated relationship that some mothers and daughters enjoy. Too much has happened. Too many boundaries have been violated. Too much trust has been broken and slowly rebuilt. But we have something that might be more valuable. We have a relationship based on reality rather than fantasy, respect rather than exploitation, and genuine care rather than codependent need. She knows now that I love her enough to let her face the consequences of her choices rather than protecting her from them. I know now that loving someone doesn't require sacrificing myself on the altar of their poor decisions. We both know that recovery from addiction and from codependency is an ongoing process that requires daily attention and commitment. Sometimes people tell me that I'm lucky things worked out the way they did, that Sarah got clean and our relationship survived the legal consequences I imposed. They suggest that I took a terrible risk in pressing charges and that it could have backfired, driving Sarah deeper into addiction and destroying any possibility of future reconciliation. Maybe that's true. Maybe I was lucky. But I've come to believe that luck had less to do with the outcome than intention and boundaries and the willingness to prioritize long-term health over short-term comfort. I think Sarah got clean not because I enabled her addiction, but because I stopped enabling it. I think our relationship survived not because I avoided imposing consequences, but because I was finally willing to impose them. Most importantly, I think I'm living the life I'm living now not because circumstances were kind to me, but because I made difficult decisions that honored my own worth and well-being. I chose to protect myself from ongoing exploitation. I chose to set boundaries that might have cost me my relationship with my daughter. I chose to build a life based on my own choices rather than reactions to other people's crises. Those choices weren't easy and they weren't without cost. But they were necessary, and they led to a life that I can honestly say I'm proud of and grateful for. They led to relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. They led to peace of mind and financial security and the kind of emotional stability that had been missing from my life for 2 decades. I think about David often, especially in the quiet moments of my day when I'm reading in my comfortable chair or watching the sunset from my balcony or simply enjoying the peace of a life that isn't constantly interrupted by someone else's emergency. I think he would be proud of the woman I became after he left, the woman who found strength he probably didn't even know I possessed. I think he would approve of the boundaries I set and the life I built and the way I honored our marriage by refusing to let it be exploited by someone who should have protected it. The pawn shop receipt that started this whole journey is long gone now, thrown away after I retrieved my ring and began the process of reclaiming my life. But I remember exactly what it looked like, and I remember exactly how it felt to find it in Sarah's pocket. I remember the moment of understanding that hit me like a physical blow, the realization that my own daughter saw me as nothing more than a source of funding for her addiction. That moment was terrible, but it was also necessary. It was the moment I stopped making excuses for behavior that had no excuse. It was the moment I stopped protecting Sarah from the consequences of her choices and started protecting myself from the consequences of her choices. It was the moment I began the long, difficult process of choosing love over enabling, boundaries over chaos, self-respect over codependent dysfunction. It was the moment I began to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my right to define my own worth rather than accepting someone else's evaluation of what I was good for. It was the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a survivor. It was the moment I remembered that love without limits isn't love at all. It's just another form of addiction, equally destructive to everyone involved. Today, as I sit in my comfortable home surrounded by the things I chose to keep and the life I chose to build, I can say with complete honesty that finding that pawnshop receipt was both the worst and the best thing that ever happened to me. Worst because it forced me to confront the full extent of how my love had been exploited and my trust had been violated. Best because it gave me the clarity and motivation I needed to make changes that saved both my daughter's life and my own. My wedding ring catches the afternoon light as I finish writing this story, 47 years after David first placed it on my finger and promised to love and honor me until death do us part. Death did part us, as death eventually parts everyone, but the love remains, transformed now into the strength to honor his memory by taking care of the woman he cherished. The ring that once represented our promises to each other now represents my promise to myself, to never again allow anyone, no matter how much I love them, to treat me as less than I am worth. That promise is one I intend to keep for whatever years remain to me, and that ring will remind me every day that some things are too sacred to be sacrificed, some boundaries are too important to be crossed, and some kinds of love are too valuable to be sold for any price, no matter how desperate the seller or how pressing their need. Some things, like dignity and self-respect and the memory of a good marriage, are simply not for sale, and I am finally wise enough and strong enough to make sure they never will be again.